Good evening, and welcome to what was supposed to have been the first Carey Library Brown Bag Lunch Lecture from last March 2020, but that, of course, was BCE, before the COVID era. So instead, we're presenting this on Zoom, and we're recording and lightly editing that presentation for archival storage on the library's website. Let me introduce myself. I'm George Sacerdote, and I'm an Italian-American who has lived in both sides of the ocean and has some very interesting experiences to share with you. I was very interested in how to maintain cultural heritage and pass it on to my children and my grandchildren, all of whom lived in the United States almost exclusively. The way I addressed this problem was to write a pair of books, Remembrance and Renewal and Memories of Memories. Remembrance and Renewal was a book of a 500-year history of 5 of our ancestral families, all of whom lived in the Duchy of Savoy, which I'll explain in a few minutes where that is in Italy, and the impact on their lives of changes in government, changes in territorial changes as a result of wars, and changes in economic policies, and so on and so forth. The second book, Memories of Memories, is a collection of autobiographical essays in which I play the role both as a disinterested observer and a native in both the U.S. and the Italian culture, where I spent a great deal of time as in my youth and also in my adulthood. Before I launch into my lecture, let me give a little bit of background about our family. This is my grandmother's country villa, where she lived summers in the hills above Turin, Italy. In the front is her house, and in the background is a game house with a billiard table and game room on the upper floor, and on the lower floor, a small rental apartment. And our family was a comfortable upper middle class family where my father worked as technology director of the telephone company, and his brother and sister both had licenses as doctors. This life came to an abrupt end in late 1938 when the Italian government decided to imitate the policies of Nazi Germany and introduce racial laws, reducing the Jews to second-class citizenship at best. On the left side is a pamphlet issued by the government summarizing the laws. On the right is a propaganda magazine issued by the government, in which a Roman sword cleaves the idealized Roman in the background from the Jew and the African in the front. As a result, our family were now no longer real citizens of Italy, even though they'd lived there for many centuries. And in fact, one branch of the family dated back all the way back to the Caesars. But we were no longer Italian despite all of this. As a result of these laws, my father lost his job as technology director of the telephone company. On the left, we can see his form letter dismissal, and on the right, we see a letter of protest that he filed with his boss, which of course did not get answered. In addition to my father losing his job, his brother and sister, who were trained as doctors, lost their medical licenses. And all three decided they would have to leave the country and go into exile. My parents decided that they would go to Switzerland with my brothers and my grandmother. My father's brother went to Paris, where he could continue the medical research that he was doing in Italy. And their sister, Eugenia, went to Argentina with her family, where her husband took a job as an executive with the Pirelli Tire Company's operations in South America. In preparation for leaving, my parents made several clandestine journeys across the Alps into Switzerland and France, and ultimately into Belgium, to deposit various valuables in banks, which would be out of the control of the Italian government, which was limiting the amount of money that people could take out of the country to $400 per person. This is a picture of my parents, my brothers, and my grandmother in Lausanne, Switzerland in early 1939. They remained in Switzerland for several months, and then my father got a job with a cousin of his who owned a small rubber reclaiming plant in south-central France. And so the family moved to France and settled in for what was probably going to be a long exile in that country. Some months later, war broke out between France and Germany, among other countries, although Italy stayed out of the war initially. But my parents had seen how badly the French had treated the refugees from the Spanish Civil War, and they expected Italy would join the war, and they would be arrested by the French as enemy aliens and treated even worse. And little did they know that, in fact, the French government subsequently sent hundreds of thousands of so-called undesirables to slave labor camps in the French colonies in the Sahara. My parents knew about the evil treatments that were happening in Germany. They had bought a couple of pamphlets, which I found among their papers, which were published by the British Foreign Office in French and were distributed in all the Hachette bookshops for a nominal price. So they knew they could not fall into the hands of the Germans under any circumstance. So they knew they had to get out because otherwise they might be arrested as enemy aliens. So my father began to make a tour of the foreign consulates in the city of Lyon looking for a new place of refuge. He even stopped at the American consulate, even though his passport was not valid for travel to the United States. It was only valid for a limited list of about 24 countries, mostly in Europe. When the American consul general heard that my father was working in a rubber reclaiming plant and as an engineer, he thought that this was an important thing because the Japanese were threatening to take over Malaya and cut off the American supply of natural rubber from Southeast Asia. And therefore, the United States would need a large supply of engineers experienced in reclaiming used rubber. So he granted them a special affidavit to use in lieu of a passport, which enabled my parents to get out of France and go to the United States. They made a mad dash across southwestern France, getting to Bordeaux during the early days of the German invasion of France. And they caught the last boat to leave Bordeaux for the United States, the Champlain. The Germans promised to sink it on the way to the United States, but in fact, the ship made a wild and crazy 10-day crossing, avoiding and eluding the German submarines, which were trying to shoot down any ships they found, and also avoiding the large supply of icebergs that were coming down from Greenland along the Canadian coast. The ship then returned to France in the middle of June of 1940, picked up another load of refugees, and then struck a mine just as it was leaving France and sank. So now let me turn to the book Remembrance and Renewal. This book had a rather odd beginning. When my brother and I were sorting through my mother's things after her death, Peter turned to me and he said, "We should write a book," meaning I should write a book, about our family's escape from Italy and from France and arrival in the United States for our children and our grandchildren. This book, we had cases and cases of materials to use as illustrations in the book, and you've already seen a few of them, including this picture here on the front cover. But after several false starts, this book ultimately evolved into a 500-year history of 5 of our ancestral families and the impact on them on European wars and politics in the Duchy of Savoy, where they all lived starting in the around 1500. The 5 families referenced in the title were the ancestors of 6 of my great-grandparents. Those in the gray box in the top row. Those 6 people were all born in the Jewish ghettos of Italy's Piedmont region, small districts in the cities in which they lived that were walled off from the rest of the city and whose gates were locked from sundown to sunup and during the entirety of Holy Week. My grandparents, who are in the middle row, were born after emancipation, and then my parents, who chose to leave in 1939, after our family, 91 years after our family had been emancipated from the ghetto. The book details how the lives of these families had evolved in response to wars and politics in their native Duchy of Savoy. And the Duchy of Savoy is the dark green blob in the northwestern corner of this map. It occupies most of the Piedmont region of Italy and the Valle d'Aosta region of Italy, and also parts of southwestern Switzerland and parts of southeastern France, including the area around Chamonix and the area around Nice. This book enabled me to write a history which bridged two threads that are common amongst historians. Those who think that history is the history of kings and queens and great politicians and statesmen and generals and wars and whatnot, and those who think that history is a history of ordinary people. And by viewing how the changes at the policy levels, at the government levels in the Duchy of Savoy affected the lives of daily people, I was able to bridge this difference. You may ask how I changed from writing a stirring story of escape from fascist Italy and France as it was collapsing under the Nazi invasion to a 500-year history. And that's actually a complicated story. And that's one of the chapters in the second book, Memories of Memories. And therefore, I'm going to go into it in a bit of detail. For many years, I had owned a copy of the census of the Jewish ghetto of the small industrial town of Chieri near Turin, the capital of the Duchy of Savoy. And in this census, among others, was my great-grandfather listed as a 12-year-old boy, and his brothers and his parents, and also his grandfather, who was a man of 87, here he is right here, and who was a contemporary of the founding fathers of the United States. Now, I really didn't know what to do with all this, though. And so the impetus to really start writing happened when my wife and I went to Argentina to attend the wedding of the oldest granddaughter of my father's sister, Eugenia. And at a family dinner, my aunt Eugenia presented me with two documents as a gift. The first was a genealogy of the Montalcini family, my grandmother's family, going back to 1700, that had been assembled by Eugenia's uncle, Emanuele Montalcini, my great-uncle. In addition, she gave me a scholarly paper written by a Montalcini cousin of mine, who was professor of history, medieval history, at the University of Pisa. And he talked about how a family named da Sinagoga, two branches of that family, had left Rome in the late 1300s and had set up banking networks in what is now Tuscany. And one family was based in Pisa and took the name da Pisa, and the other branch lived in a town called Montalcino and took the name Montalcini. Incidentally, that family was named da Sinagoga, and there was a da Sinagoga family already documented in Rome at the time of the Caesars. When I told this story to a friend of mine in Belmont, Massachusetts, also from Turin, he introduced me to a book by a woman named Renata Segre, rather 3 volumes of a book by Renata Segre. She had spent 13 years poking around in basements of courthouses and municipal archives and royal records and ducal records scattered all over the Duchy of Savoy, capturing a history of the Jews in that area from 1297 to 1797. So these were all documents relative to their life in the Duchy of Savoy. And let me give you a couple of examples of what were in that book. Here are 3 documents. The first 2, 1057 and 1058, were simply summarized briefly with a source notation so that we could find the original if we were interested in knowing the full details. Others instead were summarized but then reproduced in complete text. And this 1059 is a ducal decree that was issued by the Duke of Savoy, Emanuele Filiberto, the Duke of Savoy, in 1572. He was the fellow in the suit of armor that you saw in the picture earlier, in which, at the request of my 10th great-grandfather, the Duke was inviting Jewish bankers and merchants to come settle in his territory, and this decree laid out all the benefits that they would have and the protections that the Duke could offer them, and as well as their responsibilities and how they would be taxed and so on and so forth. However, having this volume of documents listed in chronological order wasn't terribly helpful. But when I started going through the book, I started finding the names of my paternal ancestors and my maternal ancestors as well, appearing repeatedly in these documents. And the hard part was now to assemble a genealogy out of all that, because they might have been different people with the same name, and who knows. But what we learned was that there were typically the documents would cite somebody and also cite first name and last name, and possibly either the first name of their father or the city in which they were living, or other information which would enable you to determine what their relationship was to other people of the same surname in the documents. And at other times, I had to be fairly clever. So, for example, my surname, which was originally Kohen, which in Hebrew means priest, because my family has a tradition of being descended from the biblical Aaron, the brother of Moses, who was the first high priest of the Israelites. By the way, that's a tradition that is supported by DNA research amongst other families that have the same tradition. And it turns out many of them share a common DNA signature, indicating that they were all descended from a single man back at roughly the time of the Exodus. So my name was Kohen. By the time they left Spain in 1490, the name was de sacerdotibus, which was Latin meaning of the priests. When they got to Italy, they became sacerdote, or di sacerdoti, meaning of the priests in Italian, or sacerdote, just meaning priest in Italian. And a few side branches of the family were also known as de la tribu d'Aaron, of the tribe of Aaron. And all of these you could piece together from that story and how they were related to one another. In other cases, there were people, for example, who would be cited in one document with the first name Judah, and in another document, first name Leone, which is a common Italian first name, meaning lion. And to tie those two together, one has to remember the biblical story, the prophecies of the patriarch Jacob, who on his deathbed said that his son Judah would become the lion of the Israelites. And there were a number of different stories that we had to piece together, doing translations from language to language and remembering our biblical stories to put them all together. Once we had assembled genealogies of these families and we knew a lot of details about their lives, about what they owned and where they lived and how big their apartments were and what the size of the capital was of their companies and what business licenses they had and so on and so forth, all we had to do was then take a bit of history and stitch all that together to get a very nice book. To get illustrations for the book, Carol and I went on several fact-finding trips to Italy. And the first stop, of course, was the municipal cemetery in Turin, the city where my family came from. And on the left is the tomb of the family of Leone Levy, and he was one of my great-grandfathers in the earlier illustration. And over here was his wife, Benedetta de Benedetti, and between the two of them, they produced 11 children. And then as exhaustion set in, he upped and died. So then she remarried, marrying his younger brother Samuele. And Samuele is also buried here, as are a number of other of my family relations. Here's a picture of the interior of the tomb of my paternal family. And here was my great-grandfather, who was illustrated in the census document before. Here is his wife. And then here are several lateral relations. And then here's one of my great uncles and his wife. And various other relations in the family, including my grandparents, were also buried in this tomb. Our next part, we went on a road trip, and the first stop was a town called Chieri, the town where the census came from. And we found fairly quickly the old Jewish ghetto in that town and the family house. The family house had originally been built in 1350 by the noble Solara family. In the 1400s, the King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy, and he stopped and stayed with the Solaras for a stretch and had an affair with one of the Solara's daughters, and all of this is memorialized in a plaque on the wall on the outside of the house. This area was undergoing restoration when we got there, and here's a picture of the restored front door, although you can see that there is work still to be done up here, and some of the paint was only partially done up to that point. And on top of the door, there used to be a plaque, which is illustrated here. My brother took the picture about 40 years ago. And that plaque indicated that there used to be a statue of the door, over the door, that was given to the museum, the Civic Museum of Turin, by my great-grandfather in 1875. And later on, I'll tell you the story of the quest to find that statue. Here is a picture of the synagogue room, which is in one wing of our family's house. And it was at that time undergoing reconstruction for sale as a luxury apartment, so I couldn't go inside. But I did go inside some of the other units, which were already completely restored. Here's a Renaissance ceiling in one, and the developer had hired special painters to go in and paint all these little figures that were all around the ceiling and to touch them back, bring them back to life. And here was another room in which you can find the Renaissance ceiling that you can see through a hole in the plaster ceiling that was applied in the 1700s to cover it over. And the developer chose to leave the hole and show the old ceiling as well as restore the artwork on the new ceiling of the 1700s. Our next stop was a town called Casale Ferrata, and there was a synagogue in that town that dates to 1595, and it was built in what used to be an indoor tennis court. And that synagogue is a beautiful, very ornate synagogue. It's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it had a museum where we solved a number of mysteries for the family. In that museum, I found a cup of Elijah that matched one that I have, including the same hallmarks and the same marks from the assayer who certified as to its silver content. And we also found a Shaddai amulet. These amulets were typically attached to cradles of children to invoke divine protection and guidance to the newborn baby. And we owned a cup like this, and we owned an amulet like this, and we can now date them to the late 1700s from the work that was done in the museum in that old synagogue. In the town of Aquitermi, we went to the old Jewish cemetery, and we found the broken headstone of my five-greats uncle, Giuseppe Salvatore Ottolenghi. He was a banker, and he was the uncle and legal guardian of my orphaned three-greats grandfather. And on the headstone, it listed a brief history of that fellow's career. And in Sigurð's documents, we found the lawsuit in which he defended his nephews, and also other documents in which he wrote down accounts of the revolt of the Jews in the ghettos as Napoleon was arriving, because they wanted to recover their full civil rights and knew that the French would guarantee their civil rights. The last picture I have for you on this road trip is we went to the town of Asti, where there's a nice synagogue which is no longer in use, but they have a nice museum in it. And we found this picture of the segregated ghetto school in which a teacher is giving a lesson to three very studious boys, and they're being showered with candies by an angel, while another boy who is a little bit less diligent is being given a different sort of lesson. Now let me tell you a little bit about some of the other stories that are in Remembrance and Renewal. As I had mentioned earlier, our families were Renaissance bankers in the 1500s. And while one of these banks was not much more than a glorified pawnbroking operation, the others operated on large scale with clearly modern business practices. They were into sovereign lending, municipal finance, agricultural credits, trade finance, and commodities brokerage. And in 1560, my 10-greats grandfather had become the economic advisor and financial advisor to the Duke of Savoy, Emanuele Filiberto, the fellow with the suit of armor in the earlier slide. And he put together an economic development program that included establishing mining operations in the Alps, building a commercial a trading fleet that would operate out of the Duke's port of Villefranche near Nice, and also inviting, as we saw in that document earlier, inviting Jews primarily from the Ottoman Empire to come settle and open banks and other commercial enterprises to bring the Duke's the economy of the Duke's domains up to the standards and the wealth of the other Italian principalities. In 1592, the Spain was bankrupt after the Spanish Armada went to the bottom of the North Sea, and Spain defaulted on its debts. Among those debts were debts to our family bank, And Vitalis' son, Simon, was dispatched to Spain, where he traveled under the name of Solomon Cohen, to renegotiate the debt with the Spanish government. And in exchange for rolling over the debt, he extracted a promise that the Jews in the town of Alessandria could remain open. Now, Alessandria was in the Duchy of Savoy, which was controlled by the Spaniards, and that was the only publicly open Jewish community in the entire global Spanish Empire for the next several hundred years. Another story, at the conclusion of the War of Spanish Succession in 1715, a member of a lateral branch of one of these families that was in a principality not involved in that war wound up representing the Duke of Savoy, who had just received also the title of King of Sardinia as a result of the war. He represented the Duke of Savoy at the court of Louis XIV of France, and he negotiated the settlement of their part of the war, in which, and he knew both of those kings personally. Now, how did he know them? Well, he was a commodities broker. He'd been selling grain to one king's army and lead to the other king. Later on in the 1700s, the Jews were forced into ghettos, which I described earlier as walled off sections of the cities in which they lived, in which they were locked in every night and all during Holy Week. And as their population grew, it was often, these ghettos became very crowded because it was very hard to add additional buildings to them. And it was impossible to enlarge the buildings that were there. As soon as the ghettos were opened on the arrival of Napoleon, the Jews immediately set out and became parts of the broader society, only to be re-enclosed in the ghetto after the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo. And the ghettos lasted until 1848, when they were opened again as a result of efforts by another king, Charles Albert, who was a liberal king and who was the king who began the process of trying to assemble all of Italy into one country instead of a series of independent principalities. One last story. In the 1850s, the church controlled about a third of the territory in the Duchy of Savoy. And the king wanted to add it back to the tax rolls. So he declared a land reform and seized this land and was planning to sell it off to the public. Well, the Pope didn't take very kindly to this, so he excommunicated the king and threatened to excommunicate anyone who bought church land from the king. Well, there are only two communities that didn't care about the Pope's decree of excommunication, a small Jewish community and an even smaller Protestant community that lived in the duchy. So between them, they bought up all this land from the king at a discount because the king couldn't sell it to anybody else, and then cleansed it of royal taint and then sold it to the public at market price. Now, there are many other stories about these people and how they lived and the historical context in which they lived in the book, and I would commend it to anyone who is interested in learning more about this. Now let me turn to memories of memories. After World War II was over, different parts of my family who'd gone to the Americas or who had gone to Switzerland or who had managed to hide out in Italy during the Nazi occupation in 1943 through 45, all emerged and filtered back to their homes and tried to reassemble their old lives. Among those to return was my grandmother, who was able to recover her property, including a city apartment on a wide boulevard and her beloved Valsalice estate in the country. Amazingly, the Valsalice had not been destroyed. It had been taken over by the Nazis as a command post because it had a very strategic view over the whole city and into the valleys which had passes into France on the western side of the city. While my parents decided to stay in the U.S., we wound up living a very strongly bifurcated life with long stays in Italy, as my father would go there to look after his business interests on that side of the ocean, and where most of our relatives still lived. This split life set me up as a simultaneous native and observer in both cultures. And I've included several essays on family life and education, both here and there, on my business career as an international management consultant, where I was the European to American companies and the American to European companies, and my couple of stints as an entrepreneur, and finally the experience of writing a couple of books, the ones that I'm talking about today. Now, so let me give a couple of examples, and I'm going to give you some readings from the book now. First, I want to talk a little bit about the differences in how to accomplish things in the United States and in Italy. So some years after the death of my grandmother Elvira, when my parents were emptying Valsalice in preparation for sale, they decided to ship home some of the antiques that they had inherited from her. In effect, they were bringing a bit of Valsalice to America, and they contracted with a large freight forwarding company, Gunrun, to pack up the goods and ship them from Torino to New Jersey, where my parents lived at the time. The goods arrived at the port of Newark in the summer of 1973, when I was a research fellow at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, and my parents were away on vacation. When I received the notice from the shipping company that my parents' belongings had arrived, I hired a truck and drove down to the docks with my documents to collect their goods. I drove in at the gate designated by the shipping company and found myself at the open door of an enormous warehouse, maybe 50 yards wide and 300 yards long. On one side, there was a line of idle forklift trucks with their operators seemingly asleep in their seats. Near the front door, there was a customs post where clerks would assess duty on incoming goods. And aside from that, I couldn't find anybody who seemed to be in charge. There was a guard who wandered around aimlessly. He didn't seem to care about who was coming and going or pay any attention to anyone. And I was getting pretty desperate, and I wanted to get my work done. So I walked up to the guard, and I asked him, well, who do I have to ask to locate my goods and get them inspected and loaded onto my truck? You gotta find Tiny, he said. Tiny'll help you, he replied. So how do I find Tiny, I asked. You'll know him when you sees him. Yous can't miss him. So I began to wander the warehouse again, looking for somebody who might be called Tiny. Then I spied a guy who was about 5 feet tall and 4 feet wide with a loud, gravelly voice. Are you Tiny? I asked, almost pleading. Yeah, what do you want? He growled back. Tiny, can you help me find my goods and get them out of here? I've already been here for a couple of hours, and I don't want to have to come back tomorrow and lose another day's pay. I'll make sure you don't lose another day's pay, he roared back in my ear. Let me see the papers. So I showed him the documents the shipping company had sent me, and Tiny looked around for a second and then led me down the full 300-yard length of the warehouse. I felt like I was living a scene out of the Marlon Brando movie On the Waterfront. And sure enough, right near the end was a tall stack of huge wooden crates, one of which had numbers that matched my documents. Suddenly, Tiny let out an ear-piercing whistle, and one of the sleeping forklift drivers woke up and drove down to where we were standing. Tony motioned to him to tell him which crate to pick up, and off he went with my crate. And the full time that we walked back the length of the warehouse, Tiny shouted in my ear, "He done you a favor! He done you a favor! He done you a favor!" And we all know what that means. When we got back to the front door of the warehouse, a customs inspector reviewed my documents and then waved me through without assessing any duty. Excuse me. And while he was doing his inspection, I asked the guard, how much am I supposed to give Tiny? Oh, yous don't got to give Tiny nothing. Give a 20 to the guy with the forklift, and he'll split it with Tiny. $20 then was the equivalent of about $100 today. Then Tiny turned to me and he barked, "Where's your truck? Bring it here." Within a minute, my enormous crate was loaded onto my truck, and I paid off the forklift man and was glad to get out of there with my life, my ego, and my wallet all more or less intact. And let me show you a few of the pieces that were in that case. This is a chest that now is owned by my sister-in-law in New York. And it has this beautiful inlay work on the front of it. And on the cover, on the top, there is an ivory inlay of a story from the Bible. And it's the patriarch Jacob's dream of angels climbing a ladder to heaven. It's a beautiful piece. I really love this piece. Here is a bedroom set that I own. And it was a washstand with a marble top on it. And I put a bowl on it, which would have been the kind of bowl that you would have had in the days before houses had running water, in which you would have washed up in the morning. There would have been a big jug of water next to it. You could brush your teeth and shave and so on using water in the bowl. Had a matching mirror, which is illustrated here over the washstand. And there was also a table and a chest of drawers with a marble top. Now let me give an example of how you get things done in Italy. As I mentioned earlier, I went on a quest to locate the statue that my great-grandfather had donated to the Torino Civic Museum in the 1870s. I quickly discovered that museum no longer existed. So I called my cousin Piera, who was on the city's cultural council, and I asked what had become of it. She made some inquiries and then called me back the next day saying, "One of my colleagues knew about your Torino Civic Museum. It merged with the Museum of Antiquities in the 1920s. "Oh," I replied, "I know where that museum. Isn't it in Palazzo Madama in Piazza Castello? I could go there this afternoon." "Not so fast," she replied. "You have the right museum, but it's been closed for the last 30 years for renovations." "So what do I do now?" I asked unhappily. "Let me ask around some more and see if there's a solution. Call me again tomorrow morning." The next morning, I called Piera again, and I learned that the entire collection of the Antiquities Museum was in a warehouse on the outskirts of Torino, owned by the Gondaran Company, the same company that had shipped the Valsalice antiques to our house in New Jersey. I was also told that the curator of that part of the collection was a certain Professor X, and if I called him, he might be willing to let me see my things. So I called the learned professor right away, and I explained my quest, and he agreed to help me and told me to show up at a certain loading dock at the warehouse at 10 a.m. 3 days hence. At the appointed time, Professor X greeted us at the door, and we went into an enormous warehouse, and all about us were locked shipping containers containing the museum's collection. And then Professor X took us to an open container packed floor to ceiling with paintings, tapestries, statuary, and antique furniture. On a wooden packing case just outside that container was my statue. And the professor explained to me that this statue was of an angel bearing the coat of arms of the noble Solara family, and it had been carved by an itinerant Flemish woodcarver in the 1400s, and the Solara family displayed it over their front door as a way to project their importance. And the professor then asked me if we wanted to see some of the other things my great-grandfather had donated. We readily agreed, and he motioned to a couple of workmen to unpack these items. Here's the most interesting of the remaining items. It was a wooden chest with stars of David made out of mother of pearl inlay, and then all these elaborate floral displays, and stars of David are also buried inside the floral displays. And then there was a wooden inlay of an arbor vitae tree in a large urn. Here's another one. Now, arbor vitae is, of course, the tree of life, which was the symbol of the Jewish Bible, the Torah. So this clearly had been a chest which had been part of the synagogue room in our family, and it can probably contain religious books or objects during the days when that synagogue was active. By the way, I have been back to that museum. It has since completed its renovations, and both of the objects which I've shown you are on display there now. So, in summary, in Newark, all it took to get our goods off the docks was $100. In Italy, nothing moves unless you know someone who knows someone whose brother-in-law's best friend might be willing to help you if the relationships up and down that chain are strong. Relationships are much more important in that country, even more so than in this country. We think that our current corrosively divisive politics is something new in America, but let me relate to you some family incidents from the late 1960s and 1970s when Carol and I were grad students at the University of Illinois. Now I'm going to read from the book. Our time in Champaign-Urbana coincided with the tumultuous campus turbulence associated with violent opposition to the Vietnam War, the increasingly confrontational civil rights movement, and an emerging women's rights and environmental consciousness. These movements, independently and in combination, resulted in almost daily campus demonstrations that were increasingly nasty, often threatening to turn violent. Once, when we were attending a lunchtime anti-war demonstration in front of the Student Union, I noticed several gray-suited, gray-necktied, and gray-faced men hanging out of upper-story windows with cameras with extra-long lenses. These guys were clearly FBI agents taking names of who was at the demonstration. On several occasions, the National Guard was called out, fanning out across the campus in full battle dress with automatic weapons and armored cars and tanks to break up the peace and civil rights marches. On one occasion, a confrontation occurred between the environmentalists and the campus police when students tried to take down the American flag and replace it with an Earth Day banner. The crowd of students was nose to nose with a line of campus police who were champing at the bit for the opportunity to break a few heads. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, and a compromise solution was soon offered, and the flagpole was soon sporting both banners. Another time, as an anti-war demonstration passed a McDonald's shop, the students threatened to set fire to it unless the owner took down the American flag. The owner panicked because a requirement of his franchise agreement was that he fly an oversized American flag at all times. If he took down the flag, he could lose his business, and if he did not, the shop might be burnt to the ground. So he put in a frantic call to the McDonald's head office in Chicago asking for advice. In response, a senior vice president with whom he spoke suggested that the shop owner hold off the students for half an hour to give him time to dispatch a truck full of hamburger buns that the shop owner should make sure would back into the flagpole, knocking it down. Then the students would be happy because the flag was down, and the shop owner could tell corporate headquarters the flag was down only because of an unfortunate accident. Sometimes the different political movements threatened to go to war with each other. At one point, we were in a crowd of several thousand students staging an anti-war march as it came near another equal-sized march of members of the local black community protesting the police shooting of an unarmed black teenager near campus. I guess things haven't changed much in 50 years, have they? And there was a lot of name-calling and a lot more than a little pushing and shoving between the two groups as each accused the other of insensitivity to what it thought was the more important issue. And I'll never forget the time I'd gone to the bursar's office to cash a check. I noticed that the campus policeman standing guard was wearing a large can of pepper spray on his belt. When the policeman observed my interest in his new weapon, he grabbed his billy club and nastily snarled, "What are you staring at?" And I meekly replied, "Sir, isn't that can on your belt a new weapon for you guys?" To which he snarled even more nastily, "It's a bug bomb to get rid of stinking vermin like you." At this point, he threatened me with his billy club, and I dashed out of the building, ducking into the cafeteria crowd in the nearby student union. Now let me talk about Italian political discourse during the same period. This is the story of an older cousin of mine, Carla Ovazzi. In the mid-1970s, Carla's older son, Alain Elkann, married the daughter of a wealthy Italian industrialist. About a year after the marriage, she was suddenly kidnapped by the Red Brigades, a clandestine group of radical students in Italy. And she was held for ransom. And on the left is a book that she wrote about the experience entitled 5 Red Cherries. With a subtitle, it says, "A Night That Lasted 35 Days, referring to the 35 days in which she was kept in a hole in the ground to hide her away from the police. And at the bottom of the cover is a picture of the headline in La Stampa, one of the Italian daily newspapers in Torino, which it says that the mother-in-law of Margherita Agnelli kidnapped, demanded a fabulous ransom. On the right side is a picture of a book that her son Alain wrote, obviously as an adult, about his mother. And on the cover is a picture of her holding her son as a toddler while they're on vacation in the 1950s in the Alps. When Carla was kidnapped, many of my other relatives sent all of their children out of the country for fear they too might be kidnapped. And some were sent to Switzerland and some were sent to Canada and to various other perceived safe havens. But this was not the worst of the Red Brigade's doing. About 2 years after Carla was kidnapped, they kidnapped the former Prime Minister Aldo Moro, and they held him for quite a long time, demanding a huge fortune from the government. And the government refused to play ball with the kidnappers. And finally, they put him up for a trial, a mock trial, and then they murdered him. And they left the body in a car in the streets of Rome. And here we see the headline from the 10th of May of 1978 on the New York Times, when they discovered the body, and it sent a tremor all through Europe of some of the issues of the radical politics. So now I ask you, are today's politics in the U.S. worse than they were in the 60s and 70s in the U.S. or in the 70s in Italy? That choice is up to you. There are many other chapters in the book covering my childhood in both cultures, my several educations, my remarkably varied career in academia, and then later as an international management consultant, where I was the European to American clients and the American to European clients. And my life as an entrepreneur and as a writer. The final section of the book consists of a set of stories describing the passing of old ways of life, contrasting different models by which people enjoy the mountains and the sea in the two sides of my life. And I'm now going to give you a few snippets of stories about the mountain adventures that some of us have had along the way. In our 20s, Carol and I took up wilderness backpacking with a vengeance. And in these pictures, we were on our first backpacking trip in the Bridger Wilderness in Wyoming. And we'd gone on that trip with another couple who were more experienced in backpacking than we were. This area is so remote that the big game animals like moose and elk and deer had no fear of us. And we had close encounters with these animals almost daily. We also had our first experience collecting porcini mushrooms, which you see down here, which is a delicious species and in Italy very highly prized. And in this country are relatively hard to find, although they do grow in profusion in certain places in the Rockies. And as you get to know them and their whereabouts, you get to collect large numbers of them. In fact, at one point we collected an armload of these in Yellowstone National Park. Here's another trip that we took, again in Wyoming, and this was a hike along the Teton Crest Trail. The Teton Range is just south of Yellowstone Park, and it's a group of mountains that rise very abruptly, about 5,000 feet up from the valley floor on their eastern side. And after a brutal climb up to the top, and you cross through a pass, and you get onto the western slope, which is a very gentle slope, and beautiful alpine meadows with full of wildflowers. One night, we camped by a lake called Lake Solitude, although I nicknamed it Lake Multitude because there were several other camping parties camping there that night. But you could get far enough away from them that you still had the feeling of isolation and the calm and the quiet of the high country. We came back down on the eastern slope through a canyon called Paintbrush Canyon because it was just covered in an Indian paintbrush, which is a plant that produces flowers that range from cream to pink to deep crimson red. And then at the bottom of Paintbrush Canyon, we came out to the outflow creek from one of the lakes at the base of the Tetons on the eastern side, Lee Lake, and we had a sighting of an elk on the far side, which was a perfect ending to that trip. Our most ambitious trek was one in which we had ourselves dropped by helicopter at the foot of Mount Assiniboine in British Columbia. And we hiked for 2 weeks along the Great Divide that separates the waters that flow east into the Atlantic from the waters that flow west into the Pacific in British Columbia and Alberta. And most of our trip was above tree line or just at tree line in these beautiful meadows with spectacular mountain scenery and meltwater lakes and rushing streams. It was just a delightful trip. The one downside to it is our meals were all reduced to eating these tasteless glops, which we heated up on our little camp stove, freeze-dried food. And we got pretty tired of the glops. And at one point we stopped by a lake which had a large number of really fat trout swimming in it. And the water was very cold. And we tried to fish for them. And they didn't like our lures. And they weren't interested in the grubs and worms that we dug up to use as bait. The water was so cold they were just very sluggish. So I got it in my head that I could catch one of these with my bare hands. So I took off my socks and my shoes and my jeans, and I waded into this frigid water. But the fish were cleverer than I was, and as soon as I got within an arm's reach of one of them, it would give one flick of its tail and stay just out of reach. Now, as we've been hiking along for several days, at some point we started to smell pretty bad, and Carol suggested that we'd better take a real bath and not just a sponge bath in water that we heated up in our little camp stove. And we had about a pint of water to share for bathing every day. And so we took a swim in the lake that's on the right side. This lake had a small glacier on the far side of it, which was calving off ice cakes in the water. And we lasted about 10 seconds screaming before we got out, and then we had to lay in the sun for about half an hour to get the chill out of our bones. One of the last days on the trip, we had to cross a very fast-moving meltwater river. We had two choices for crossing it. One was to cross it on a snowfield that spanned it. The snow was still about 10 feet deep there. And the hope you had to have was the snow would hold and you wouldn't fall through and end up in the drink, because if you did, you'd be swept away. The alternate was to cross on a tree trunk that had fallen across the stream a little further down from the snowfield, but that was all slippery and wet and full of moss, and the footing on that looked really dangerous. We finally elected the snowfield, and mercifully it held. Had it not held, we would have been swept away, and they would have found us in Hudson's Bay, 1,500 miles away. But the Alps, the Italian Alps, were part of my blood also, and they started very early. I remember going to Cervinia in 1948, which is at the foot of the Matterhorn, which sits astride the Italian-Swiss border, with my parents and my brothers. And I so much love the Italian Alps that I made sure that I introduced my family to them as quickly as I could. So in 1972, I returned to Cervinia for a ski trip with my wife, Carol, and here she is pictured on pretty much the same place as the previous picture was taken. And notwithstanding a small accident that she had there, the Alps became an important part of her blood too. As our kids grew up, we brought them back there many times. On the left is two pictures on this slide of a trip to Courmayor, which is the end of the Valle d'Aosta, right at the foot of the Mont Blanc, which sits astride the French-Italian border. And about 10 miles north of there is the corner where Italy and France and Switzerland all come together. The picture on the left, we're in a pass between France and Italy. And on the Italian side was a large sign welcoming you to Italy. And on the French side was a large sign cautioning you that you were now in France and had to obey French law. In the lower right is a picture of my two sons, who I think were 5 and 8 at the time, standing in front of a cheese cave that was being rebuilt. At that stage, in the early 80s, there were still many farm families that would drive their cows up to the high mountain pastures above tree line, where there was a rich growth of summer grass and wildflowers. And the cows would produce prodigious quantities of milk up there. And the farmers would then turn that into butter and cheese, and that was their primary cash crop for the year. Quite recently, Carol and I returned to the Valle d'Aosta, and we had taken our kids to a number of other areas in the Valle d'Aosta over the years, including Cervinia and also the Gran Paradiso National Park, which was built out of an old game preserve, royal game preserve, and has spectacular Ibex, which are large antelope with long curved horns, and they're amazing creatures to see. This last picture, the last slide here, is from a trip that we took to Gressoney quite recently. This area had been a tourist area already in the 1850s. We found a rusty plaque up above tree line next to a small chapel, and it was commemorating the passage of young Tolstoy at age 18. As he was passing from Gressoney into the next valley, the Valley of Champoluc, to its west. The Italian royal family had originated in these Alpine valleys, and when the King Humbert I was assassinated in 1900, his widow built herself a palace in the Valley of Gressoney, and it's pictured in the lower left. And instead of having formal gardens, she had it planted all with alpine flowers. And it's a very pretty garden, and it's a beautiful little palace. She became a very adept mountain climber and climbed all the high peaks in that area, including the Monte Rosa, which is pictured to the right, although it was more heavily glaciated then than it is even now. In the Gressoney Valley, the old lifestyle is one of the few valleys in the Italian Alps that still preserves the old lifestyle, where the farmers migrate during the summer and live in small cottages, often very primitive cottages, in the high country, and they feed their cows. Here's a sign pointing to a baita, one of these little cottages, in which they were prepared to sell you butter and cheese. And then here's an abandoned baita that we passed from another farm family that had given up on this migratory lifestyle. And you could still find a few odds and ends of when they'd occupied it. In the back here is the spigot from the spring that was the water supply for the family that lived there. That, of course, didn't have indoor running water at all. But it's still such a beautiful region that I highly recommend to anyone who would like. But the best part of the Alpine experience is, instead of sleeping on the ground on stones and eating tasteless glops for dinner, you got to stay in a nice, warm, comfy bed, get a hot shower at the end of the day, have a well-prepared and well-served dinner and a glass of wine. That's a much nicer way to end the day than downing a bit of nasty glop and some hot tea. So with that, I'd like to give you one final story. And it's a story that happened to us in the Tetons at the end of the little run that I had of them earlier in this show. After we came down from the Teton Crest Trail, we took a campsite in the public campground at Jenny Lake. And this was a noisy campground. There were a lot of people. And as we were eating dinner that night, a young woman came in to our area and said she'd just come back from a backpacking trip and gotten in too late to get a campsite. Would we mind if she slept in a corner of our site? And we reluctantly agreed. We weren't very happy about it, but so be it. And the next morning, we had breakfast with her, and she told us that she'd just come back from spending 3 days at a remote campsite on the western shore of Lee Lake, which is right at the foot of the Tetons. And she'd gotten a beautiful suntan there. This sounded really appealing to us. We were pretty tired from our treks in the high country, and we certainly didn't appreciate the noise of the public campground. So we went later that morning to the ranger station to sign up for a campsite on Lee Lake. And while we were there, the ranger told us the following story. The day before, a middle-aged couple had come in, spitting nails angry. And they said, well, we were hiking along the eastern shore of Lee Lake, and we looked on the far side, and we saw a young woman naked, swimming naked. Isn't that terrible? And even worse, there were 2 little old ladies on our side who were exposed to this indecency. And worst of all, the little old ladies then took off their clothes and jumped into the lake as well. Now, what, sir, are you going to do to put a stop to these goings-on? So I looked at the ranger, and I asked him, well, what did you do about that? And he sort of smiled, and he said, well, I haven't done anything yet, but I'll write a report to the chief ranger, and I'm sure after the tourist season, he'll want to have a little investigation. And with that, he then signed our permit, and we then went to Lee Lake, and we had a very enjoyable couple of days, quietly resting, swimming in the lake, and it was just a delight. Now, to contrast that with a story on the Italian side, many years later, we went to Italy with our kids on one of our several trips to Italy. And we were invited to stay for a couple of days with a cousin of mine at his house near the beach in southern Tuscany. Well, we got there, and it was a hot, dusty afternoon. And after lunch, my cousin suggested we all go down to the beach and take a swim. So we did, and we went down to the beach. And one of our kids was very tired, so he offered to stay on the beach and mind our stuff while the rest of us went in the water. And he promptly fell asleep. About half an hour later, an Italian woman came along and turned to him and asked him the time. And he was, of course, asleep. So then she asked him a second time, just as his eyes were opening. And as he opened his eyes, he found himself face to face with a topless woman. He immediately lost his tongue in both English and Italian. So then she picked up his wrist, looked at the time on it, and said, "What an idiotic child," and stomped off in a snit. And thus, with that story, I will end my lecture of today, and I will tell you that both of the books I talked about are available at the Cary Library. For signed copies of either book, you can reach out to me at george.sacerdote@gmail.com. Memories of Memories, the second book, is also available in print and as an ebook at Amazon and other booksellers. Remembrance and Renewal I distribute privately, so if you'd like a copy, you have to reach out to me. And with that, I will take some questions, and I look forward to having an interesting discourse with the group. Thank you very much for listening to my lecture.